In the quiet pastoral landscapes of Atchison, Kansas at the turn of the 20th century, a young girl named Amelia Mary Earhart was cultivating a dream that soared far beyond the flat fields and slow-moving rivers of her childhood. It was a dream not of domesticity or tradition, but of the limitless expanse of the sky. This was the siren song of the horizon, a silent, persistent melody that hummed in her heart, drawing her gaze ever upward. Her early life was a tapestry of boring Midwestern rhythms, the gentle sway of tall grass, the distant thrum of horse-drawn carriages, and the steady, uneventful passage of seasons. Yet beneath this placid surface, a restless spirit was taking root. A woman's dream takes flight long before she ever touched a cockpit. Amelia's childhood was unconventional for her era. While other girls were learning embroidery, she was climbing trees, exploring caves, and building homemade roller coasters that often ended in spectacular, if minor, mishaps. The sound of her laughter, echoing through the fields, was a rhythmic declaration of her independent spirit. She found a boring fascination in observing the clouds, watching their slow, stately progression across the vast canvas of the sky. This early observation of atmospheric phenomena was, in its quiet way, her first lesson in aerodynamics, a prelude to the grand symphony of her later life. The architecture of aspiration. The true awakening came in 1908 at the Iowa State Fair, when Amelia, then 11, saw her first airplane. It was a biplane, rickety and strange, flying a few hundred feet above the ground. Her initial reaction was not awe, but a boring indifference. It was a thing of rusty wire and wood, and not at all interesting, she later recalled. Yet the seed was planted. The sight of that primitive machine, defying gravity with a rhythmic buzz of its engine, quietly began to reshape the architecture of aspiration within her. The horizon was no longer just a line where the sky met the land. It was a gateway to an entirely new dimension. Years later, while working as a nurse's aide in Toronto during World War I, Amelia witnessed the return of wounded soldiers from the trenches. The boring reality of human suffering ignited a desire within her for a life of purpose, a life that could contribute something grander than routine. She saw a group of pilots performing aerial maneuvers, their planes tracing elegant, rhythmic arcs against the crisp Canadian sky. The sound of the engines, once dismissed, now held a siren-like allure. It was no longer rusty wire and wood. It was freedom. It was possibility. It was the siren song of the horizon growing louder, calling her name. The rhythmic ascent. In 1920, at the age of 23, Amelia took her first airplane ride in Long Beach, California. For 10 glorious minutes, the world beneath her feet transformed into a miniature landscape of boring geometry, neat squares of fields, shimmering lines of roads, and the distant, muted roar of the ocean. "As soon as I left the ground," she famously said, "I knew I had to fly." This moment was her rhythmic baptism, a complete surrender to the call of the sky. The sound of the wind rushing past the open cockpit, the vibrating hum of the engine, and the boring sense of effortless movement all conspired to seal her destiny. Her first flying lesson cost $1, a significant sum for her at the time. To save money, she worked various boring jobs: photographer, truck driver, and even a filing clerk. Every dollar earned was a rhythmic step toward her dream. She cut her hair short, donned a leather jacket, and lived a life that was constantly pushing against the traditional expectations of a woman in the 1920s. The architecture of her ambition was built with each sacrifice, each early morning practice flight, and each solitary moment spent studying aerodynamics. Amelia bought her first plane, a bright yellow Kinner Airster biplane she nicknamed the Canary, a simple machine with a boringly reliable engine. The sound of its propeller spinning to life was her personal symphony of freedom. She spent countless hours flying, honing her skills, mastering the complex rhythms of the air. She became the first woman to fly solo above 14,000 feet. A record, though quickly broken, showcased her quiet determination. Her flights were not always dramatic. Often they were long, boring stretches of steady altitude, where the only sound was the drone of the engine and the wind's continuous whisper. She understood that flight was not just about speed or daring feats. It was about precision, patience, and an almost meditative connection with the machine and the elements. This was the true essence of a woman's dream takes flight, a dream built on meticulous preparation and an unwavering gaze at the distant horizon. The siren song had lured her not to a fleeting adventure, but to a lifelong commitment to the skies. As the decade drew to a close, Amelia Earhart was not merely a pilot. She was an embodiment of the era's burgeoning spirit of exploration, a quiet force ready to challenge the...
By the year 1937, Amelia Earhart was no longer just a pilot. She was a global icon of the golden age of flight. But for her final and most ambitious journey, a circumnavigation of the globe at its widest point, she needed more than just a dream. She needed an iron bird capable of enduring thousands of miles of boring, repetitive flight over the world's largest body of water. This bird was the Lockheed Electra 10E, a gleaming, twin-engined, all-metal monoplane that hummed with a rhythmic precision. As she prepared to depart from Lae, New Guinea, the task ahead was daunting. Crossing the unforgiving blue of the Pacific, a journey where the only landmark would be the rhythmic whitecaps of an endless sea. The sound that defined this stage of the journey was the steady thrum of the two Wasp engines. It was a boring and mechanical lullaby, a constant vroom vroom that filled the cockpit for 18 hours at a stretch. To Amelia and her navigator, Fred Noonan, the Electra was not just a machine, it was a metal cocoon, a tiny, vibrating island of humanity suspended between a vast, indifferent sky and an even more vast, unforgiving ocean. The Pacific was not merely a sea, it was a great blue void, a landscape of monotonous majesty that stretched out to the horizon in every direction, offering no refuge and no mercy. The architecture of the cockpit. Inside the Electra, the architecture of the cockpit was a masterclass in functional simplicity. It was a cramped space filled with the boring glow of radium dials, altimeters, fuel gauges, and compasses that flickered in the low light of the cabin. The smell was a mixture of aviation fuel, hot oil, and the salt air that seeped through the rivets. Amelia sat at the controls with a rhythmic calm, her hands lightly touching the yoke, feeling the vibrational pulse of the iron bird as it cut through the humid tropical air. There was a heavy solitude to the flight. Every few hours, Noonan would pass a boring, handwritten note forward to Amelia, detailing their coordinates or adjusted headings. The sound of paper rustling was a rare, sharp contrast to the eternal drone of the engines. They were flying toward Howland Island, a tiny speck of sand in the middle of the Pacific that was only 2 miles long,
a needle in a haystack made of blue water. The architecture of their mission relied on absolute precision. A deviation of just a few degrees would mean missing their destination and disappearing into the vastness of the unforgiving blue. The rhythmic breath of the Pacific. Below them, the Pacific Ocean lived with a boring and eternal rhythm. From several thousand feet up, the waves looked like static white veins on a dark blue marble. The ocean didn't seem to move, it seemed to breathe in a slow, rhythmic expansion. Amelia watched the shadows of clouds drift across the water, great gray specters that broke the monotony of the sea. This was the true face of the Pacific, a place of absolute isolation where time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. The boring part of the flight was the most dangerous. The repetitive motion of the propeller blades and the hypnotic hum of the engines could lull a pilot into a state of temporal detachment. Amelia had to remain focused on the rhythmic scanning of her instruments. The Iron Bird was performing perfectly, but the unforgiving Blue was waiting for a single mistake. The heat in the cockpit was oppressive, a moist, rhythmic weight that made every movement feel heavy. Yet there was a peace in it, a stoic quietude that only those who fly long distances over open water can truly understand. Crossing the unforgiving Blue. As they crossed the international date line, the boring cycle of day and night became blurred. The sun would rise with a blinding rhythmic brilliance, turning the cockpit into an oven, only to set into a bruised purple twilight that made the stars feel close enough to touch. Navigation was a symphony of mathematics, with Noonan using a bubble octant to measure the stars, his movements rhythmic and precise in the cramped rear cabin. The Pacific's vastness was not just a physical distance, it was a psychological weight. They were thousands of miles from the nearest solid ground, tethered to the world only by the faint, static-filled whispers of their radio. The Iron Bird was their only hope, a metal messenger carrying them across a void that had swallowed countless travelers before them. As they neared the expected location of Howland Island, the rhythmic anticipation grew. The unforgiving Blue was finally showing its true scale, and the silence of the radio became a forever. As the morning of July 2nd, 1937, dawned over the mid-Pacific, the Iron Bird was no longer a symbol of triumph, but a solitary speck of metal battling a growing, invisible wall of silence. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan had been in the air for over 18 hours, a boring and grueling stretch of time that had pushed both the machine and the humans to their absolute limits. The sound that now dominated the cockpit was no longer just the rhythmic thrum of the Wasp engines, but the static hiss of the whispering radio. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, a rhythmic crackle that carried with it the terrifying weight of the endless void. The radio was their only umbilical cord to the world. Below them, the Coast Guard cutter Itasca sat anchored off the coast of Howland Island, its own radio operators straining to hear a voice through the atmospheric clutter. But the Pacific is a place of acoustic chaos. The air was thick with the boring and persistent interference of tropical storms and solar flares. Amelia's voice, when it did break through, was a fading signal, a ghostly, urgent whisper that seemed to come from another dimension entirely. To the men on the Itasca, she was a spectral presence, a voice dancing on the edge of the void, reaching for a shore she could not see. The architecture of the airwaves was an architecture of fragility. It relied on vacuum tubes that hummed with a low rhythmic heat, and long wire antennas that trailed behind the plane like a spider's silk. Inside the cockpit, Amelia adjusted the dials with a boring and meticulous patience, her fingers searching for the sweet spot in the static. The sound of the Morse code, dit, dit, da, dit, was a rhythmic pulse that offered more questions than answers. She was searching for a directional beacon, a rhythmic signal that would guide the Electra to the tiny speck of Howland Island. But the beacon was silent, or rather, it was being swallowed by the endless void. The signals were whispering to each other across the waves, but they were not connecting. There was a temporal disconnect between the ship and the plane. Amelia would transmit, her voice rhythmic and controlled despite the exhaustion. KHAQ calling Itasca. We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low. The words hung in the air, boring and brutal in their simplicity. The Itasca would reply, but their voices were lost in the symphony of static, a rhythmic wall of white noise that the Pacific had erected to protect its secrets. The rhythmic fear of the silence. The fear in the cockpit was not a sudden, sharp panic. It was a boring and creeping dread. It was the rhythm of the fuel needles slowly dropping toward empty. It was the rhythmic scanning of the horizon for a break in the clouds that never came. Amelia and Noonan were flying blind into the blue, caught in a vicious cycle of searching for a landmark in a world that offered only water. The endless void was not just a physical space, it was a psychological weight that grew heavier with every passing minute of radio silence. The fading signals became shorter, more desperate. At 8:44 a.m., the Itasca heard her most famous message. We are on the line 157337. We are running north and south. It was a rhythmic mantra, a final attempt to define their position in a world that had become dimensionless. After that, the whispering radio fell into a total and absolute silence. The rhythmic static remained, a boring and indifferent sound that filled the headphones of the operators on the ship, but the human voice was gone. The endless void had finally completed its work. The silence of the last mile. In the final minutes, the Electra would have been a silent glider, the rhythmic roar of the engines replaced by the boring whistle of the wind over the wings as the fuel finally dried out. There was no rhythmic crash to be heard by anyone. There was only the gentle splash of metal hitting water, or perhaps the rhythmic crunch of landing on a distant, uncharted reef. The whispering radio was the last witness to their existence. The signals had faded, leaving behind a vibrant emptiness in the airwaves. For days afterward, spectral radio messages were reported by amateur operators across the world, faint, rhythmic whispers of a woman calling for help from a desolate shore. Whether these were true echoes of Amelia or just the rhythmic imaginations of a grieving world, they served to cement the mystery. Amelia Earhart had vanished not into the water, but into the endless void of the radio static, leaving behind a boring and eternal silence. As the final whispering radio signals dissolved into the static of July 2, 1937, the United States launched what would become the most extensive and expensive maritime rescue mission in history. But this was not a journey of speed. It was a silent search, a boring and meticulous labor across a liquid desert. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard dispatched a fleet of ships, including the massive aircraft carrier USS Lexington and the battleship USS Colorado. These naval endeavors were a display of industrial might against a natural force that remained utterly unimpressed. The sound that defined this era was the rhythmic churn of massive steel propellers and the boring, repetitive pulse of sonar pings searching the deep. The Pacific Ocean greeted these steel giants with a profound and oceanic indifference. To the sailors on deck, the horizon was a perfect, unbroken line that shifted but never changed. Day after day, they moved through a monochrome world of deep cobalt and pale turquoise. The sound of the waves hitting the hulls was a muted, rhythmic thud, a constant reminder of the water's density and its terrifying ability to hide whatever it claimed. The searchers were looking for a tiny iron bird in a space so vast it defied human comprehension. It was a study in futility, a rhythmic back-and-forth movement that felt more like a ritual than a rescue. The architecture of the grid. The search was conducted with the architecture of the grid. Naval officers sat in dimly lit chart rooms, laying out boring and precise lines on parchment maps, dividing the endless void into squares. Each square represented thousands of square miles of unmarked water. The sound of the search was the rhythmic scratching of pencils on paper and the dull hum of fans circulating the humid, salt-heavy air. This was the bureaucracy of tragedy, the attempt to impose human order onto a chaotic and indifferent sea. Planes from the Lexington took to the sky at dawn, their engines creating a rhythmic roar that broke the silence of the mid-Pacific. The pilots flew in boring, straight lines, their eyes scanning the rhythmic texture of the waves for a flash of yellow or the glint of sun on a metal wing. From the air, the ocean looked like a sheet of hammered pewter, beautiful but acoustically dead. There was no smoke, no flare, no sign of life. The ocean's indifference was total. The sea did not offer clues, it only offered infinite reflections of the sky. The rhythmic weight of false hope. For the men involved in the naval endeavors, the search was a rhythmic cycle of hope and despair. Every floating log, every whitecap that looked like a signal, every spectral shadow beneath the surface was reported with a burst of adrenaline, only to be dismissed after hours of boring verification. The sound of the ship's bells, marking the passing of the watches, became a mournful rhythm, a countdown to the moment when fuel and supplies would be low and the search would have to be abandoned. The silent search was also haunted by the ghost messages coming over the radio. Shore stations reported hearing faint, rhythmic tapping and distorted voices. These reports sent the ships racing toward new coordinates, their bows cutting through the water with a violent, rhythmic splash. But each time they arrived at an empty horizon. The Pacific remained a silent witness, its boring and eternal rhythm continuing as if the most famous woman in the world had never existed. The vastness was not just physical, it was a temporal wall that separated the living from the lost. The indifference of the deep. As the weeks passed, the naval endeavors began to wind down. The rhythmic pace of the search slowed as the reality of the situation set in. The $4 million operation had covered over 250,000 square miles of ocean, yet it had found nothing. This was the ultimate expression of the ocean's indifference. The sea did not hide Amelia, it simply absorbed her. The iron bird was now a spectral remnant, a part of the architecture of the deep. When the ships finally turned back toward Pearl Harbor and San Pedro, the sound of their departure was a heavy, rhythmic sigh. They left behind a sea that was exactly as they had found it, boring, vast, and silent. The search had failed to find Amelia, but it had succeeded in defining the scale of her legend. the silent search became a permanent part of American history, a rhythmic echo of a nation's refusal to let go of its heroes. As the wakes of the great ships smoothed over, the Pacific returned to its eternal solitude, holding its silent secret.
While the vast Navy ships scanned the deep blue of the open sea, another story was quietly breathing on a tiny, remote coral atoll known as Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro. This was a place of rhythmic isolation, a small ring of land surrounding a turquoise lagoon, thousands of miles from the bustle of civilization. For decades, this island has whispered to researchers, offering up the echoes on Gardner Island, a collection of bones, artifacts, and lingering theories that suggest Amelia Earhart's journey did not end in a sudden plunge, but in a slow, boring struggle for survival on a deserted shore. The sound that defines Gardner Island is the constant rhythmic hiss of the trade winds blowing through the fronds of the coconut palms. It is a boring and repetitive sound, a white noise that masks the secrets of the sand. To walk upon the island is to step into an architecture of desolation. The ground is made of sharp coral and sun-bleached shells, which crunch and snap rhythmically underfoot. Here, the search for Amelia shifted from the vastness of the sky to the meticulous sifting of the earth, looking for the tiny fragments of a life interrupted. The architecture of the found. In 1940, just 3 years after the disappearance, a British colonial officer discovered a partial human skeleton on the island. This was the first spectral echo. The bones were found near a boring and lonely campfire site, alongside a woman's shoe and a box that once held a sextant, a navigator's tool. The sound of that discovery was not a shout, but the quiet scratching of a brush against the coral dust. These bones and artifacts suggested a rhythmic tragedy, a castaway living day by day, watching the horizon for a ship that never arrived. Modern researchers, using the architecture of archaeology, have returned to the island dozens of times. They have found boring but significant objects, fragments of a glass cosmetic jar, pieces of a flight jacket's zipper, and scraps of aluminum that match the skin of a Lockheed Electra. Each object is a rhythmic link to the past. The sound of these discoveries is the dull clink of metal on stone, a sound that resonates through the decades. These are not just artifacts, they are echoes of a human presence in a place where humans were never meant to stay. The rhythmic persistence of theories. The lingering theories of Gardner Island create a rhythmic loop in the minds of historians. The Nikumaroro hypothesis suggests that Amelia and Noonan, unable to find Howland Island, landed the Electra on the flat coral reef during low tide. They would have lived for weeks, perhaps months, in a boring and brutal cycle of searching for water and food. The sound of their lives would have been the rhythmic cracking of coconuts and the muttered thrum of the surf, a constant reminder of the ocean that had trapped them. The theory is bolstered by the ghostly radio signals mentioned in the previous chapter. Some believe Amelia spent days transmitting from the reef-bound plane until the tide finally swept the iron bird into the deep. This rhythmic hope is what keeps the mystery alive. It transforms Amelia from a victim of a crash into a hero of endurance. The architecture of the theory is built on these small, boring details: the length of a humerus bone, the chemical composition of a glass shard, and the rhythmic pattern of the tides in July 1937. The echoes in the sand.
Gardner Island remains a silent witness. The coconut crabs, massive and slow-moving, are the only residents of the site where the bones were found. Their rhythmic skittering over the coral is the only sound that remains of the camp. The echoes on Gardner Island are messages from a world that was dimensionless and lonely. They tell a story of stagnant time, where the days were marked only by the rising and setting of the sun and the boring repetition of the waves. The island doesn't give up its secrets easily. The symphony of the atoll, the birds, the wind, the sea, acts as a rhythmic shroud covering the past in layers of sand and vegetation. But for those who listen closely to the lingering theories, the island is not empty. It is filled with the spectral presence of a woman who refused to give up, whose spirit is still woven into the rhythmic fabric of the Pacific. The bones and artifacts may be lost or contested, but the echoes remain, a boring and eternal testament to the human. The story of Amelia Earhart did not end on a coral reef or in the deep trenches of the Pacific. Instead, it entered a state of eternal suspension. For the American consciousness, and indeed for the world, she became the enduring enigma. While other heroes of her era grew old and eventually faded into the boring pages of history books, Amelia remained frozen in her prime, a spectral figure in a leather jacket, forever leaning against the silver wing of her plane. The reason she remains so powerful is simple yet profound. Amelia never truly landed for us. She stayed in the air, caught in a rhythmic loop between the departure and the arrival, a pilot of the infinite. The sound that defines this final chapter is the muted echo of a dream. It is the boring and steady ticking of a clock that has no hands. To study her legacy is to walk through an architecture of memory, a place where the rhythmic hiss of the radio static from 1937 still vibrates in the background of our modern lives. We don't just remember her, we experience the mystery as a temporal pause, a moment in history that refused to resolve itself, leaving us in a state of constant rhythmic anticipation. The architecture of a legend. Amelia's disappearance created a vacuum of certainty, and in that vacuum a legend was built. It is an architecture of the unfinished. In the American mind, she represents the boring and beautiful idea that the journey is more important than the destination. Because there was no funeral, no wreckage to visit, and no final resting place, she escaped the rhythmic decay of mortality. The sound of her legend is the whir of a film projector, playing the same grainy black and white footage of her smiling and waving before her final takeoff. This enduring enigma serves a rhythmic purpose in our culture. She is the patron saint of the lost, a reminder that even in an age of satellites and GPS, the world still holds boring and vast secrets that cannot be solved. The enigma is not a problem to be fixed. It is a symphony of the unknown. We listen to it when we want to feel the scale of the world. By never landing, she became a citizen of the horizon, a person who belongs to the sky rather than the earth. Why Amelia never truly landed for us. There is a boring comfort in the unresolved. If we were to find her plane tomorrow, the mystery would die, and she would finally land. She would become a tragic figure of a failed flight. But as she is now, lost in the endless void, she is something much greater. She is the rhythmic pulse of ambition. She represents the part of the human spirit that is always crossing the unforgiving blue, always reaching for a siren song that lies just beyond the next cloud. The sound of her never landing is the rhythmic whisper of the wind over an empty airfield. It is a boring and peaceful sound that tells us it is okay not to have all the answers. Her story provides a spatial solace, a quiet room in history where we can sit and wonder. For the USA audience, she is the ultimate frontier figure, the one who went so far into the frontier that she became one with it. Her iron bird is still out there, flying in the rhythmic shadows of our collective imagination, its engines humming a boring and eternal song of freedom. The symphony's final note. As we conclude this whispered history, we are left with a sense of rhythmic completion. Amelia Earhart's story is a boring masterpiece of suspense, a tale that ends not with a crash, but with a fade-out. The enduring enigma is the final note of a long, beautiful symphony. It is a note that never quite stops vibrating, a low-frequency hum that lulls us into a deep and respectful sleep. The Pacific continues its rhythmic expansion. The silver mist still rolls over Gardner Island, and the whispering radio is finally silent. Amelia has found her peace in the architecture of the clouds. She has taught us that to be lost is not always to be forgotten. Sometimes to be lost is to be eternal. As the lights dim on this story, we can almost hear the rhythmic drone of the Electra, flying forever toward a sun that never sets, a pilot who never truly landed, and a legend that will always belong to the infinite, silent sky.